Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Most countries are born through revolution, rebellion, or war, but Canada took a different route. Its story begins not with violent upheaval, but with a quiet determination to unite diverse lands and peoples under a shared vision. Unlike the dramatic independence movements seen elsewhere, Canada's formation unfolded through negotiation and diplomacy, a deliberate and thoughtful process shaped by compromise rather than conflict. This peaceful journey, however, was not without its complexities. It involved navigating the lingering influence of colonial powers, balancing the ambitions of French and British settlers, and recognizing the vast, diverse indigenous nations who had called this land home for millennia. The path to Confederation in 1867 was paved by leaders who sought unity through law and dialogue, choosing cooperation over confrontation. What emerged was a nation built on the principles of gradual progress, mutual agreement, and an enduring belief in peace as a foundation for strength. Before Canada became a nation, the land was a patchwork of powerful indigenous nations and competing European colonies. Long before European contact, indigenous peoples had established complex societies with their own governance, trade networks, and spiritual traditions. When the French arrived in the early 1600s and established New France, they formed alliances with some indigenous groups, particularly for fur trading, while also bringing profound disruptions to indigenous life. The balance shifted in 1763 when the British defeated the French in the 7 Years' War and took control of New France through the Treaty of Paris. This marked the beginning of British dominance in what would become Canada, although French language and culture persisted strongly, especially in Quebec. The American Revolution soon followed, shaking the continent. Many in British North America watched the rebellion to the south unfold, but chose loyalty to the crown. Tens of thousands of United Empire Loyalists fled north to remain under British rule, settling in regions like Nova Scotia and what would later become Ontario. Unlike the American colonies, which were larger, more economically independent, and increasingly resentful of British interference, the Canadian colonies were smaller, more reliant on Britain for defense and trade, and more culturally divided. These factors, along with fears of American expansionism, encouraged a more cautious, gradual approach, one that favored dialogue over revolution. By the mid-19th century, the province of Canada, which combined Canada East, mostly French-speaking, and Canada West, mostly English-speaking, was in a state of political deadlock. The two regions had equal representation in government, but their differing cultural values, languages, and political goals made it nearly impossible to pass legislation. This gridlock frustrated progress and highlighted the need for a new political structure that could better represent the diverse interests of the colonies. At the same time, economic pressures were mounting. The end of the Reciprocity Treaty with the United States in 1866 cut off favorable trade terms, pushing the British North American colonies to seek stronger economic ties among themselves. A united domestic market seemed not just practical, but essential for growth. Another growing concern was the threat from the South. The American Civil War had shown the might of a centralized, militarized government, and there were widespread fears in British North America that a victorious, expansionist United States might turn its attention northward. The idea of Confederation began to take hold as a way to strengthen internal defenses, unify governance, and promote stability. Central to this vision was the creation of a transcontinental railway, which would link the scattered colonies, open up trade routes, and foster economic integration across vast and varied regions. Together, these political, economic, and security concerns created a powerful momentum toward a peaceful unification. In 1864, leaders from several British North American colonies gathered in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, originally to discuss a possible union of the maritime provinces. However, representatives from the province of Canada, Canada East and West, arrived with a more ambitious proposal to unite not just the Maritimes, but all of British North America into a single federation. What began as a modest meeting soon turned into a pivotal moment in Canadian history. The Charlottetown Conference marked the beginning of serious talks about Confederation. The delegates, despite coming from vastly different regions and backgrounds, found common ground in their shared concerns: political instability, economic isolation, and vulnerability to American aggression. Over days of formal meetings and informal social gatherings, bonds formed and a sense of possibility emerged. This momentum carried into the Quebec Conference later that same year, where the discussions became more structured and substantive. Delegates from the major colonies, Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, came together to outline the foundations of a new federal system. From these debates emerged the 72 resolutions, a detailed blueprint for how the future Dominion of Canada would be governed. These resolutions proposed a strong central government, but also granted provinces control over local matters, a balance that reflected the diverse identities within the proposed union. The resolutions also included provisions for a bicameral legislature, recognizing both representation by population and regional equality. Behind the scenes, Britain supported the idea of Confederation, but did not impose it. The British government saw unification as a practical solution to the administrative and financial challenges of maintaining scattered colonies, especially after the costly Crimean War and amid shifting priorities. However, they left the decision largely in the hands of the colonial leaders, encouraging the process but not forcing it. This allowed Confederation to emerge as a homegrown initiative, shaped by the unique needs and aspirations of those who would live under it. The Charlottetown and Quebec conferences laid the intellectual and political groundwork for a peaceful and voluntary union, an achievement rare in world history. In 1867, the British Parliament passed the British North America Act, a landmark piece of legislation that officially created the Dominion of Canada. Rather than emerging from war or rebellion, Canada's birth as a nation was sealed thousands of miles away in London, in the chambers of Westminster. The Act united 4 founding provinces, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, into a single federation under a new federal government, with powers divided between the national and provincial levels. This legal foundation granted Canada internal self-government while maintaining ties to the British Crown, symbolizing both independence and continuity. What made the British North America Act so remarkable was how it represented a peaceful and deliberate transfer of power. Britain, recognizing the growing maturity and capability of its North American colonies, chose not to resist their push for greater autonomy. Instead, it worked collaboratively with colonial leaders to craft a constitution that reflected both British legal traditions and the specific needs of the Canadian territories. There were no battles fought, no revolutions sparked, only negotiations, compromises, and careful planning. The Act itself enshrined many of the 72 resolutions drafted at the Quebec Conference, embodying the vision laid out by the Fathers of Confederation. This peaceful approach to nation-building was virtually unprecedented at the time. While other countries gained independence through conflict and civil strife, Canada emerged quietly and methodically through diplomacy and legal process. Britain's role was not one of coercion, but of cooperation, allowing its former colonies to shape their own future while providing the legal framework to make it official. In doing so, the British North America Act didn't just create a country, it established a tradition of negotiation, federalism, and constitutional evolution that would continue to define Canada for generations. Following Confederation in 1867, Canada began a process of gradual expansion that would eventually stretch the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific and deep into the Arctic. The first major addition came in 1870 with the creation of Manitoba, carved from the vast lands of the Hudson's Bay Company. This expansion was soon followed by British Columbia joining Confederation in 1871, drawn by promises of connection to the rest of Canada through a transcontinental railway. Prince Edward Island, which had initially rejected Confederation, reconsidered and joined in 1873 after being offered assistance with its debts and the promise of improved communication and transportation links. Over the decades, other territories and provinces would be added, each one contributing to the mosaic of Canada's geography, economy, and identity. Central to this nation-building effort was the Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885. This monumental project physically united the country, allowing goods, people, and ideas to travel across the vast Canadian landscape. It fulfilled a key promise made to British Columbia and symbolized Canada's growing sovereignty and confidence. But the railway and western expansion came at a great cost, particularly to Indigenous peoples. As settlers moved westward, Indigenous communities were displaced from their lands through treaties that were often misunderstood, poorly enforced, or outright violated. The government implemented policies that marginalized indigenous cultures and livelihoods, such as the reserve system and the introduction of residential schools, institutions that would inflict deep and lasting harm. Despite these injustices, Canada's expansion did not involve large-scale wars or internal rebellion. The nation continued to grow through negotiation, compromise, and legal frameworks, reinforcing its identity as a country founded on peaceful evolution rather than violent revolution. Still, the darker chapters, particularly the treatment of Indigenous peoples, remain a vital part of the story. They serve as a reminder that peace is not simply the absence of war, but the presence of justice, and that the legacy of nation-building must be understood in all its complexity. Even after the creation of the Dominion of Canada in 1867, full independence was still a distant goal. Canada had its own parliament and control over most internal affairs, but key powers, especially foreign policy and constitutional amendments, remained under British control. Canadian diplomats needed British approval to negotiate international treaties, and decisions about war and peace were made in London. This meant that Canada, though a self-governing dominion, was still tethered to the British Empire in significant ways. A major turning point came with the Statute of Westminster in 1931. This act, passed by the British Parliament, granted full legislative independence to Canada and other dominions such as Australia and New Zealand. For Canada, it meant the power to make its own laws, including foreign policy, without interference from Britain. It was a quiet but transformative moment. Canada could now sign treaties, appoint ambassadors, and chart its own course on the world stage. However, one key element remained unresolved. Canada's constitution, the British North America Act, could still only be amended by the British Parliament. That final step toward full sovereignty would not come until 1982, with the passage of the Constitution Act. Spearheaded by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, this act patriated the Canadian Constitution, bringing it home from Britain and giving Canada full control over its own constitutional changes. It also introduced the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a powerful document that enshrined civil liberties and democratic principles at the heart of Canadian law. With this act, Canada completed its long, measured journey to full independence, not through bloodshed or sudden rupture, but through careful negotiation and legal transformation. The peaceful evolution of Canadian sovereignty stands as a rare example in a world where independence often comes at the end of a rifle, not the stroke of a pen. Canada's peaceful path to nationhood stands out in contrast to the revolutions that marked the birth of many other countries, particularly its southern neighbor, the United States. Several key factors explain why there was no War of Independence in Canada. First and foremost was Britain's relatively flexible attitude toward its North American colonies. Unlike in the 1770s, when the British fiercely resisted American demands for autonomy, by the mid-19th century, British leaders were more willing to grant self-government to responsible colonial administrations. They recognized that managing distant territories was costly and complex, and they preferred a cooperative, stable arrangement over the risk of rebellion. Another major reason was the absence of a widespread revolutionary ideology in Canada. While American colonists were driven by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, republicanism, and anti-monarchism, Canadian settlers, especially the Loyalists who had fled the American Revolution, generally valued order, gradual reform, and continued ties to Britain. Many Canadians saw benefits in the British system, such as protection, trade, and a functioning legal structure. The population was also highly diverse, with English and French speakers, Indigenous nations, and immigrants from across Europe. These groups had different interests and priorities, making radical unity around rebellion unlikely. Additionally, the strong presence of British military forces served as a deterrent to armed uprisings. Unlike in the American colonies where British authority was spread thin, Canada had well-established garrisons and naval access that made rebellion both risky and logistically challenging. Rather than pursuing a confrontational path, Canadian leaders chose negotiation, careful planning, and legal reform to address their political and economic concerns. This preference for compromise over conflict became a hallmark of the Canadian identity, shaping not just how the country was formed, but how it would continue to evolve in the decades to come. Canada's formation stands as a powerful example of peaceful nation building, a process defined not by revolution or bloodshed, but by negotiation, compromise, and gradual evolution. The country's path from a collection of colonies to a fully sovereign nation offers a rare historical model where diplomacy prevailed over conflict. Through conferences, legal agreements, and constitutional reform, Canada built a federation that respected regional differences while fostering national unity. It showed that diverse populations, Anglophones, Francophones, Indigenous peoples, and immigrants, could come together to shape a shared future without resorting to violence. This legacy of peaceful unification remains a point of pride and a foundation for Canada's national identity. Yet Canada's story is far from perfect, and its peaceful origin does not erase the challenges that persist. One of the most enduring has been the question of Quebec's place in Confederation. For decades, movements advocating for Quebec sovereignty have reflected the tensions between national unity and cultural distinctiveness. Though these tensions have been largely addressed through political means rather than violence, they reveal the complexity of maintaining unity in a diverse federation. Even more pressing is the ongoing need for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The expansion of Canada came at a devastating cost to Indigenous communities, whose lands were taken, rights denied, and cultures systematically suppressed. Acknowledging and addressing this history remains one of Canada's greatest moral and political challenges today. Still, the Canadian experience offers valuable lessons for the world. It demonstrates the power of patience, dialogue, and institutional flexibility in building a nation. It shows that compromise does not mean weakness, and that strength can come from inclusion rather than domination. As other countries struggle with division, violence, or authoritarianism, Canada's journey reminds us that peace is not only possible, it can be the foundation for a durable, democratic society. To recap, Canada's peaceful path to nationhood is a remarkable story of diplomacy, compromise, and gradual change. From the Charlottetown and Quebec conferences to the British North America Act and beyond, the creation of Canada wasn't marked by revolution or bloodshed, but by careful negotiation and respect for diverse cultures. While Canada has faced its challenges, particularly with Quebec's sovereignty and the ongoing process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the peaceful foundation of its nation-building remains a key part of its identity. So here's a thought. Could more nations be born without war today? With global tensions rising and divisions growing, is it still possible for countries to emerge through dialogue and compromise instead of conflict? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful history content. And be sure to stay tuned for our next video, where we'll dive into the forgotten rebellions that nearly changed Canada. You won't want to miss it.